Part 3 is learn how to forgive. Many people come to me and think that forgiveness is a feeling. It's not. Forgiveness is simply a choice. When I first moved to Maui about 22 years ago, I used to go to the beach a lot. And one day I was at the beach and met this couple. And they had just moved here from Hollywood, which sounds pretty, fun. So I was talking to them, and what usually happens is people start telling me their life stories. So this girl started telling me her life story, and it turns out that her stepfather had sexually abused her for most of her young childhood, and she had gone through counseling a lot. Anyway, I listened to this story for several days because I would see them every time I went to the beach. And I finally just asked her, I said, have you ever forgiven him? And she goes, oh, that's just it. I went through counselor after counselor, and I would get to this point and I can't forgive him. And I went, oh. And at that moment, the Lord gave me the thought that unless you have been forgiven, you can't forgive. And obviously she was not a Christian. She had never accepted Jesus as her Savior, and thus she had never known forgiveness. So she was unable to forgive. She was waiting for some sort of feeling to happen, or some sort of thing to change in her heart, and that's not going to happen. Forgiveness is a choice. You have to choose to forgive. And what I always tell people is, if it's not a feeling and you can't conjure up the feeling, then you ask God to accomplish forgiveness in you. You choose to forgive and then ask Him to accomplish that forgiveness in you. And He will. He totally will. So we're going to do a sample prayer of how you forgive parents and how you prayed through that. So the prayer is quite simply, I choose to forgive you, Mom and Dad, for whatever it might be. In this case, of this woman, for abusing me sexually for all these years. And then you have to ask the Lord, because they were your parents or step-parents, Lord, forgive me for judging them, because we want to break that cycle of judgments. Hebrews 12:25 says, be careful and let no bitter root spring up in you, therefore defiling many. So a bitter root happens when you've made a judgment, especially against your parents, and then it becomes a universal law in your spirit. In other words, if your dad was adulterous, you make this inner determination, this bitter root, that all men are going to be that way. And like I did, you will then be attracted to or attract men that are adulterous. And if they aren't, the bitter root will actually cause people to sin against you. In other words, you will push all their buttons until you get the behavior that you're used to out of them. This is one reason after people get married, it seems like the spouse changes, but they don't really change. It's the other person pulling their bitter root expectations out of the other one and causing them to sin against them. Let me give you an example. The classic example is of a young man who was totally rejected by his father as he was growing up. And every boss he had, every male he came across, he would pull out rejection from them. And the final straw came as he finally got a job he loved. He was doing really well. His boss was getting ready to call him in and promote him and give him a huge raise. And as he's going into the office, the young man pushes all his boss's buttons and gets him raging at him, furious at him, and he winds up firing him. And the boss is left going, I don't understand what happened. I fully intended to promote him, and I wound up firing him. But the young man's bitterroot expectations actually pulled that response out of him to get him to sin against him. if you recall my experience from the first segment of this in judgments, I had judged my father as adulterous. And how did I reap that? I reaped it by finding or pulling out from other people only men who were married. That's how it manifested in my life. But it was my bitter-root expectation that all men are adulterous. So I pull that behavior out of people. And even if they weren't married, if I started dating them, they became adulterous. So this is how a bitter root works. You will attract what you expect.